Hi, I'm Kev Roberts, the host of Northern Soul Time. A return to a great guest, a very knowledgeable guest, who's going to focus on the year of 1975. Tim Brown's with us. Hi, Tim.
Hello there, Kevin.
Great to see you, as always. We're focusing on something that you were very interested in because you wrote a book about it called 1975. Why should we focus on this particular year, Northern Soul-wise?
Well, first I've got to say I think it was an absolutely historic year for Northern Soul with all the things that happened during that year. And on a purely personal note, it was my first year fully immersed in it. I had a history with Northern Soul going back 3 or 4 years before then. But 1975 was the year I lived the life. I lived the nightlife.
Okay. And what was rocking your world in 1975? Because obviously, as we're going to talk about very shortly, there were a lot of changes. We'd suddenly come out of the Javels and very stompified playlists. Some brilliant records too, great discoveries, Double Cooking, I Can't Help Loving You, You Don't Love Me, Epitome of Sound. That was 74, but 75 brought a whole new playlist.
It really did, because we mentioned some of the records, maybe didn't even mention them, like Lady's Choice, Bobby Franklin, Carstairs, that had changed the manner, the tempo, the production values of Northern Soul. But in 1975, these were adopted wholesale by the whole scene. As you know, Wigan, to a certain extent, had been very resistant to the concept of anything that wasn't a traditional 60s stomper. Well, Wigan played as many of the new release type modern, although we're going to touch upon that and say it wasn't called modern soul then. They played as many of those as anybody else did. And then, of course, during the course of the year, we had Cleethorpes emerging as a major player, and they played plenty of them too. In fact, for me, as a young person, attending all-nighters and starting collecting records and that kind of thing, I didn't particularly see any difference between Esther Phillips' What a Difference a Day Makes and Johnny Ross's stomping version of I Can't Help Myself.
Yeah, it was all part of growing up, wasn't it?
It was all part of the same thing. No one was dividing it up. Yes, for sure, there were records that you only heard at the Highland Room, Blackpool Mecca. Absolutely. And there are also records heard at the Highland Room, Blackpool Mecca that you heard before anywhere else. And also Cleethorpes played plenty. But other than the fact that they'd been playing it probably at the Blackpool Mecca first, I don't really remember ever thinking to myself, this 1975 record is very different to that 1966 record. Yeah. I didn't.
Well, what do you think the extremes were at that moment in time? Just give us a couple of examples, Tim, of extremes.
I think there are 2 good examples of the extremes. And as far as I'm concerned, they both came from Cleethorpes. One is East Coast Connection, Summer in the Parks.
Yeah.
Which at the time, even I thought, I don't understand what kind of Northern Soul this is.
Yeah.
Really, I didn't. And that was played at the same time as Willie Mitchell, The Champion, was revived.
Yes.
Apparently, they played it in the dim and distant past off the Driving Beat LP, but it never was a really big record, and they revived it at that time. Well, you can't have 2 greater juxtapositions than those 2, really.
And then we're going to move on to a track that we're going to play in a moment, which I think found the middle ground between all those scenes, or all those playlists, I should say, and it spilt over to the local disco as well. The guy who put it together, I do know, Warren Schatz. Just explain your thoughts about one of the first big songs of 1975. It was a new release, yet it caught the imagination of pretty much everybody.
It did. I've got to be honest and say I don't remember ever hearing it in local clubs, but it certainly was played across the Northern Soul scene. Came out fairly quickly on a British label. It's the Brothers. Are you ready for this? Incidentally.
And it was easy, wasn't it? It sounded easy to dance to, I think.
And it didn't sound wrong at 2:30 in the morning at Wigan Casino. It didn't sound wrong. To me, there was no, oh my goodness, listen to this, I think it's new. and it's an instrumental and it's a little bit disco-y.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything wrong with it at all.
Well, there must have been something in it because it's huge today still, isn't it?
That is the most amazing thing for me.
Yeah.
That it came back. It's probably been big now for 20 years.
It has.
That it actually came back, because even a year or two later, after its 1975 release, you couldn't shift a copy for 25 pence.
On social media, I see Warren Schatz commenting, and whenever he crops up on forums where there's Northern Soul people hanging around, it's the only thing they want to talk to him about, which is amazing, really, because he's done Evelyn Champagne King and lots of other good records in his career, but that's the one they always.
And what does he think about that? Because the record went nowhere as an American new release. Really.
That's right. He like everybody else, he's pleased that somebody in the world likes it. But I'll tell you what, let's have a listen to it. The Brothers, Are You Ready for This? A choice from 1975. We're looking at the year 1975. Good choice from Tim. Are You Ready for This? The Brothers. A big record then and a big record now. The diversity we were talking about, Tim, you gave us some great examples in a few minutes ago. There were characters, though, that also had an influence with tailor-mades. Two such, Simon Soussan and Ian Levine. What can you recollect about those characters?
They were more than characters. They were huge figures on the scene. I don't know whether I would refer to them just as characters. That sounds like someone that smokes a pipe back to front, wears a funny hat. These were big influences on the scene. Simon had been providing records for 3 or 4 years that he discovered. And Ian, of course, well, Ian is Ian, but he was far ahead of the game by virtue of the finances that were available to him. So he'd amassed this enormous collection there in Blackpool, and he had a very broad attitude to Northern Soul. For instance, he introduced Carstairs at a time when that tempo and that tricky rhythm was out of flunter with everything else. And also, when you look back at the history of Northern, he actually played Lou Edwards, Talking About Poor Folks, long time before it became popular.
James Fountain,
that's another. So Ian was very alive to the changes that could happen within a Northern Soul format and was responsible for them. But they both had one common denominator, of course, Kev. They weren't happy to discover the records. They weren't happy to proliferate the music. They weren't happy just to play records. Both of them wanted to make records. And that's one of the other big things about 1975. Yes, we can say that Simon in particular had other things happening in 74, but just like the modern type, new release type records, it all exploded in 75.
Give us some examples.
Well, of course, we'd had a couple of things in the charts. One enormously in the charts. I don't know what figure in the charts Wigan's Chosen Few Footsie got to in January.
Probably
but
11,
it was high.
I think, 11 or 12.
Yeah, pretty high. Certainly top 20.
January 75.
Certainly top 20. And the music industry was, to a certain extent, looking at Northern Soul and saying, is there a shilling to be made here? So then you get the groups like Wigan's Ovation and all the awful cover versions as well. But taking due notice of this in Blackpool and Los Angeles were Simon Soussan and Ian Levine.
And both extremely knowledgeable about Northern Soul.
Yeah, both knew the score, and as a result of knowing the score or thinking they knew the score, were capable of making Northern Soul, what became known as tailor-mades.
Yeah.
And which in Ian's case in particular threatened at one time to swamp the scene until people said, whoa, enough.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because a list arrived with some records for sale, because in those days, of course, you used to get a mail order list. And on that list was a fictitious record called Reaching for the Best by Bob Relf, which I'm sure tongue-in-cheek from Simon, but let's hope there was nothing darker than that. But it was his lovely way of saying, I have found a brand new exclusive. But little did he know that Ian Levine had also got his eyes on creating something. Why not take that title, Reaching for the Best?
Yeah, Simon put it on the list.
He did.
To make it the list look more exciting and entertaining.
Yes.
Whereas in actual fact, the record didn't exist at all.
Exactly.
And Ian sat there in Blackpool, said, good idea, I'll use that title.
Yeah, and shared it with Herb Rooney, who was in the Exciters, the leader of the Exciters, the wonderful lead vocals of Brenda Reed. And the magic happened because, as Brenda explained to me on a podcast some years ago, Herb got that melody going. Ian was full of ideas. But at the end of the day, she says it was a good song and I sang my heart out. And she did.
And they also did some cover versions, of course, Sandy Sheldon.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
I'm not too sure they didn't do Love You Baby. Everyone wanted to do Love You Baby
they did,
at the time.
They did Love You Baby, yes, they did. But I think Reaching for the Best will go down as their best 70s, mid-70s track to kickstart that tailor-made movement.
So should we listen to that one now?
I think we ought to. Here it is, The Exciters, a big hit too, Reaching for the Best.
I've got the price of a Ford. I'm looking for a Rolls Royce. I want an evening gown. I can't afford a house dress. I want something better than all the rest. All my life I've been reaching for the best. Reaching for life's happiness. Reaching for the very, very best. Ooh, yeah. I want a bucket full of money, but I don't have a pocket.
For me, the best of the tailor-mades, Tim, that Reaching for the Best, the Exciters, the wonderful Brenda Reed on lead vocal. But there were others that are really Marmite for most people, and we had to endure Footsie by Wigan's Chosen Few, which was a creation by Simon Soussan, of course, but then there's a twist and a turn before it actually made the charts. You can tell us about it.
Well, really, yeah. I mean, the genesis of that particular record is in the previous year when it was played as The Sound of Soul.
Yes.
With a completely different intro to the one that ended up on the single and a completely different middle section. And of course, the whole thing was redesigned for British release because the essence of the record was an American roulette release, actually originally a Canadian release, for a toy advertisement.
Yes.
So that's the genesis of it, the origins of it. Simon changed it around, and then for UK release, it was changed yet again because they were a bit worried that somehow Simon had rights to the original mix.
Yeah.
So that changed again for the British release, which, as you know, soared into the charts in January 75.
It certainly did.
I'm going to take a short break and we'll be back to talk to
Tim Brown. So Simon missed out ultimately on some fees for that one, some royalties, but boy did he strike back. And he struck back on a new label that was distributed by CBS called Black Magic.
Yeah, he did. He had the versions of Papa Mau Mau and Going to a Go-Go as well. People had forgotten about that one, but that also charted. That was after Papa Mau Mau.
Which he reused again in Shalimar, Uptown Festival.
That's what Simon circulating records, I don't believe it.
But tell us your thoughts about those two My take on it at that time was that there was a little bit more euphoria and hype around those than the dance floor being full.
I'm not so sure you're right. They were accepted. No one was particularly fighting against them. Another one you could add to that little coterie of tunes would be Tommy Hunt's version of Cracking Up, which also was absolutely enormous during 1975. And there wasn't a great deal of resistance to it. It's just when Ian started coming with a whole bunch of more tunes, Barbara Pennington, etc., etc., etc. And everyone, not least at the Blackpool Mecca, realised there was going to be absolutely no end to it, and in some ways enough was enough.
Yeah.
The things such as Weak Spot and Your Magic Put a Spell on Me, they were towards the end of 1975 and actually charted in early 1976, but not in the top 30, which stopped the songs ever being aired on Top of the Pops, although they were recorded.
However, there were some credible new discoveries in 1975. There was a delightful young lady, there is a delightful young lady still alive, and pleasure to meet her, called Carol Waller. Well, what do you remember about this one exploding on the scene? Remember, it's not a tailor-made, this was a discovery, and it brought 60s stompers back onto the turntables at Wigan Casino.
Yes, there were plenty of bona fide golden era archetypal Northern Soul records played. They hadn't died off. It's just that everything was mixed in together, but there were still plenty of great 60s came along. I picked the Carol Waller record because, first of all, it had been a big Blackpool Mecca spin, and people don't normally associate that kind of a record with Blackpool Mecca in 1975.
Yeah.
But it had been popular there, and then it moved on to Wigan, and it's only in recent times, courtesy of people like yourself, particularly yourself actually, that we found out who Carol was, because I've long had her other USA single, and it didn't strike me that it was particularly by a soul singer. And of course, in recent times, that's been answered.
Yes.
Because, not to put too fine a point on it, Carol Waller isn't a black person.
And she's a lovely, soulful version of Brenda Lee. That's how I marked her, and she thanked me for saying that. She is very much like Brenda. She's got that lovely country feel, but a bit more raucous and aggressive, that gave her that lovely R&B feel.
And she must have felt that she was aligned with soul music and R&B to a certain extent, because the B-side of the record is a cover version of the Gladys Knight record, Stop and Get a Hold of Yourself.
It is, and none of us played that at the time, which is very, very strange. But let's have a timely reminder, away from the tailor-mades, that there was some good old-fashioned American Northern Soul music waiting to be played. Here's Carol Waller, This Love of Mine.
This love of mine goes on and on. Your life is empty since you've been gone. When you're away, I just sit in a trance. When you're around, I wanna dance. Come on now, like you're always on my mind, go out of sight. I'm lonely every day and every night. When you're away, I just sit in a trance. But when you're around, I wanna dance.
A fantastic song, Carol Waller, This Love of Mine, and you've got some other selections to tell us about. We're talking about your book, 1975, which is 50 years old. This month, I think it is.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, it's important. I mean, we've talked about some of the things to do with new releases and tailor-mades, but overall, the Northern Soul scene was still governed by great records. Mel Britt, She'll Come Running Back. I'm just looking through the book here. Florence DeVore, Kiss Me Now. Otis Blackwell, It's All Over Me. That's in just 2 facing pages.
Yeah. Interestingly, you're on those pages, Tim, because although I'm no expert on pricing and collectability, there's one that stands out. I mean, there's a big difference between Mel Britt, Otis Blackwell, and Florence DeVore.
There is. I'd be tempted to say that Mel Britt is inflated by demand. Otis Blackwell actually is quite rare on a stock copy. The promo you see, stock copy you don't. Florence DeVore, a massive non-hit. But the point I'm really trying to make is that there were still plenty of great records which tick the right boxes. I mean, one of the most popular records you could play to this day would be Willie Mitchell, The Champion.
Yes.
That was revived really in 1975. Old timers will tell me it got a few spins at the wheel, but it really became big in 75, along with others of their kind. Here's two more. Better Use Your Head, Little Anthony. Played before, but really became big in that year.
Yeah.
Bunny Siegler, Girl Don't Make Me Wait.
Yes.
Played before,
Yes,
but
it was,
became
yeah.
big in that year.
Yeah.
And then there were, of course, all the genuine new discoveries. Robbie Lawson, Burning Sensation. Pointer Sisters, Sending Back, that had never been played before. And really an absolute huge amount of great records. Lou Pride.
Yeah.
I'm Coming Home in the Morning, another 1975 record.
And it's interesting, you were looking at labels there. We were talking about Black Magic, we were talking about Spark, Right On.
Dave Godin's Right On
label. That's right, so, with my late dear friend Bill Downs. That was they were putting together some interesting music. So
and you see, Kev, and that's the point. It was a time, I think 1975 and 1976 were a moment in the history of Northern Soul when more people were into the culture than had been the case before, and possibly had been the case ever since. For a small generation, and it was not a full generation by any means, but as a small fragment of the young people of Britain, it never been so popular and never been so numerous in terms of the attendances at venues. We forget now. We get some very big events. We've got Blackpool Tower and all the big events, but they're periodic. In those days, Wigan was every week. Yes. Not only that, Cleethorpes was every week. And not only that, before the pair of them, Blackpool Mecca, Highland Room, that was every week.
And an awful lot of Monday nights and Tuesday nights and Wednesday nights, Thursday night gigs as well.
Absolutely. In Todmorden in 1975, with the aid of a car, possibly, you could do Northern Soul 7 nights a week.
Yeah.
You might have to go 10, 15 miles, Halifax, Caroline's in Manchester, but you could actually do Northern Soul every night of the week if you wanted to do
How
that.
lucky we were.
I didn't do it 7 nights a week, did you?
No. Well, actually, yeah, I was probably gigging at that time. I was doing a lot of clubs in the Midlands, certainly for a good while. But Tim, this has been your second visit to Northern Soul Time, and it's great to have your knowledge and your intelligence and your great overview of not only rare record collecting, but also looking back on the book, and it's 50 years.
I've always got a saying, Kev, and it stands as much for life in general as it does for Northern Soul. Remember the way it was at the time. And this book seeks to tell it the way it was at the time.
If you ever wanted to know about 1975, 50 years ago, Tim Brown is your man. Tim, thank you very much, my friend.
Great to see you again, Kev.
Always
Thank you.
great to see you. Tim Brown has been with us. Hey, thanks for watching. See you next time for another episode of Northern Soul Time. To listen to some of the great music we've been talking about today, click the links below. If you want to buy great Northern Soul music, visit charlydirect.com.